Justice does not stop at an apology. Matthew Jackson was born and raised in a poor neighborhood in the southern part of a large American city. His parents, James and Angela, were hardworking black individuals who struggled to overcome financial difficulties and daily discrimination. However, they instilled in Matthew the importance of justice and perseverance. Justice doesn't come naturally. "Son," his mother often said, "it's something we must fight for." From a young age, Matthew was aware of the injustice surrounding him and his family. Being stopped by the police for walking down the street, receiving suspicious looks in upscale stores, and hearing covert racial remarks, these experiences left a deep mark on him. Yet, rather than succumbing to these injustices, Matthew resolved to stand up and make a difference. He wanted to become the person people could turn to when they were wronged, abused, or treated unjustly. The path he chose to achieve this goal was becoming a civil rights attorney. Throughout high school, Matthew excelled in both academics and leadership. He wasn't just a brilliant student but also a leading voice in discussions about justice, human rights, and equality. At debate competitions, his ability to analyze and articulate arguments stood out. He saw the world with a profound sense of understanding, knowing that justice was not just about right and wrong but about the root causes of social issues. His teacher, Mrs. Julia Anderson, once remarked, "Matthew is not just an excellent student, he's a person willing to stand up for what he believes in. That makes him special. He doesn't just study the law, he lives it." His love and passion for justice drove Matthew to attend law school at one of the country's top universities. There, he learned from renowned civil rights lawyers and professors who inspired him to continue pursuing his dream of protecting the oppressed. Law school, however, was not an easy journey. Matthew faced not only the overwhelming academic workload but also subtle discrimination from some of his peers and professors. In an environment where black students made up only a small fraction of the student body, Matthew often felt isolated. He overheard murmurs, "He only got into this school because of affirmative action, or a black lawyer. Probably just to defend criminals." Each time, Matthew remained silent, choosing instead to focus on his studies and refine his skills. He knew the only way to prove them wrong was to become the best. Matthew's time in law school only strengthened his resolve to fight for civil rights. He joined legal debates, human rights organizations, and volunteered at legal aid centers for the poor. He realized that too many people were denied access to the legal system, either because they couldn't afford it or because they didn't know how to claim their rights. The law should be a tool to protect people, not oppress them, he once said at a justice symposium. Upon graduating with honors, Matthew quickly joined a prominent civil rights law firm. Here, he participated in many high-profile cases, defending victims of police brutality and helping families discriminated against in employment and everyday life. Matthew wasn't just a technically skilled attorney, he genuinely cared about his clients. He often spent hours listening to their stories, not just to understand their cases but to empathize with their struggles and pain. One notable case involved a black family who had been brutalized by the police. The police raided their home without a warrant, falsely accusing them of drug possession, and assaulted them in the process. In court, Matthew skillfully presented how the police had violated the family's human rights and abused their power. The victory in that case not only brought justice to the family but also solidified Matthew's reputation as a leading civil rights lawyer. Matthew understood that his work wasn't just about winning individual cases, it was about changing a broken system. He knew the law enforcement system, particularly its treatment of black people, needed a complete overhaul. He often spoke publicly on this issue, calling for major reforms in police training and oversight. He believed that only by holding those in power accountable could real change be made. However, not everyone agreed with Matthew's stance. He received threats from those who opposed his views, especially from extremist groups and some members of law enforcement. But Matthew never wavered. He knew the path he had chosen wouldn't be easy, and he was prepared for every challenge. Then one day, as Matthew was driving home after a long day in court, something happened that he had never expected. That afternoon, after defending a family in a case of workplace discrimination, Matthew drove home, reflecting on the next steps for the trial. As he navigated the familiar streets, his mind swirled with ideas. But suddenly, something unexpected happened. As he approached an intersection near his home, a police car turned on its flashing lights and sirens, signaling for him to pull over. Matthew was surprised but not worried. As a lawyer, he knew his rights and felt confident he hadn't done anything wrong. However, when he saw the two officers, Robert and James, step out of the car with aggressive postures, a sense of unease crept in. Despite being an accomplished attorney, Matthew knew firsthand the fear that came with being black and interacting with the police. "Step out of the vehicle immediately," Robert shouted, his tone leaving no room for discussion. James stood by, expressionless but with his hand resting on his weapon, ready to escalate the situation if Matthew resisted. Matthew stayed calm. "I'm an attorney, and I need to know why you're pulling me over," he said, his voice steady but firm. Robert gave him a disdainful look. "You match the description of a suspect in a vehicle theft," he replied, ignoring the fact that Matthew was driving a luxury car that showed no signs of being stolen. Knowing the situation could turn dangerous, Matthew tried to keep his voice calm. "I have all my paperwork. I'm not the person you're looking for," he said, reaching for his documents. But Robert and James didn't care. They had already made up their minds that Matthew was guilty, or at least someone they could easily target. Robert moved closer, grabbing Matthew and yanking him from the car. In an instant, Matthew was shoved onto the pavement, his face pressed against the rough asphalt. His arms were forcefully cuffed behind his back. Despite his protests, bystanders on the street began to gather, pulling out their phones to record the scene. Within minutes, the video of Matthew's arrest began circulating on social media, amassing thousands of views and shares. The community quickly erupted in outrage, especially once they learned that the man being arrested was Matthew Jackson, a well-known civil rights attorney. Robert and James ignored the growing crowd and Matthew's objections. They dragged him into the patrol car and drove him to the station. Inside the car, Matthew remained silent. He knew that anything he said could be used against him, even though he was completely innocent. Matthew was taken to the police station, still grappling with the reality of his situation. Throughout the ride, he kept silent, breathing deeply to stay calm. Despite his deep understanding of legal rights, the brutal truth dawned on him: being a lawyer didn't shield him from the abuse of power that many people of color face daily. He felt like a statistic, another victim of a system that treated black men as criminals by default. As the patrol car pulled into the police station, Robert ordered Matthew to get out of the car. "Get out and follow us," Robert barked. Matthew complied, despite the simmering anger and frustration in his chest, knowing that resisting now would only make things worse. In a matter of minutes, he was led into a cramped, cold holding cell, sitting on a metal bench, under the harsh fluorescent lights. Matthew's mind raced with thoughts, not just about his current predicament, but also about the many cases he had fought, the people he had defended in similar situations. He remembered the faces of clients he had represented, innocent black men and women, wrongfully detained and abused by a justice system that was supposed to protect them. Now, he was living their nightmare firsthand. Outside the station, a wave of fury and indignation was building. Within an hour of Matthew's arrest, a crowd had gathered at the police station. Civil rights supporters, activists, and ordinary citizens were all expressing their outrage at the police's treatment of Matthew. They held signs, chanted for justice, and demanded answers. At the station, tension filled the air. Lieutenant William, a seasoned officer, was alerted that a prominent civil rights lawyer named Matthew Jackson had been arrested. Recognizing the name immediately, William felt a knot tighten in his stomach. Matthew Jackson wasn't just any name, he was a well-known lawyer with a reputation for winning high-profile civil rights cases. Arresting someone like Matthew could have serious repercussions. William immediately requested reports from Robert and James. As he reviewed the flimsy, vague documentation, his unease grew. "We're in deep trouble," William thought to himself. But he knew he needed more information before taking any action. "Robert, James, get into my office now," William called over the radio. A few moments later, the two officers walked in, looking confident, as if they had just caught a dangerous suspect. "Do you realize what you've done?" William began, his tone stern. Robert, with his usual arrogance, shrugged. "We arrested someone who matched the suspect's description. What's the problem, Lieutenant?" William narrowed his eyes, trying to contain his frustration. "The person you've arrested is Matthew Jackson, a civil rights attorney who has represented countless victims of police misconduct. He's not the suspect you think he is." Both Robert and James hesitated, their confidence faltering. But they still clung to their belief. "We were just doing our job, sir. If you want to verify it, go ahead. But we don't think we made a mistake," James said, attempting to justify their actions. William knew this was more than just a simple mistake. He understood that if this situation wasn't handled properly, it would become a public relations disaster, especially with the growing unrest outside the station. "I'll be looking into this myself," William said coldly. "And you two better prepare yourselves for questioning." William immediately researched Matthew's background further and discovered something shocking. Not only was Matthew a prominent civil rights attorney, but he was also a federal investigator working undercover. He was in the middle of investigating a major criminal organization involved in money laundering and corruption, including corrupt police officers. William realized this situation was far more complicated than it initially seemed. William promptly called Police Chief Johnson and reported the entire situation. When Johnson heard that Matthew Jackson, a federal investigator, had been falsely arrested, and by his own officers, he knew they were in deep trouble. "We're facing a full-blown crisis, William," Johnson said, his voice tense. "We need to handle this carefully and quickly before it spirals out of control." Police Chief Johnson was a seasoned leader who had dealt with many tough situations in his career. But this one was unlike any other. Arresting a prominent civil rights lawyer, especially in the midst of heightened national tensions around racial injustice and police misconduct, was a potential public relations nightmare. Furthermore, arresting a federal investigator without any legitimate reason could lead to serious legal and political consequences. Immediately after speaking with William, Johnson called for an emergency meeting with senior officers. In the meeting, he stressed that the situation needed to be handled with transparency and urgency to avoid further escalation. "We cannot allow this situation to spiral," he said firmly. "If we don't act quickly and decisively, we'll lose the public's trust." After careful consideration and consultation with legal advisors, Johnson made a swift decision: Matthew would be released immediately, and a public apology would be issued the next morning. He also initiated an internal investigation into Robert and James' actions to determine whether they had violated any civil rights or abused their power. Before making the official announcement, Chief Johnson asked William to personally meet with Matthew and apologize for the incident. He wanted to show good faith and seriousness in addressing the mistake. William, following orders, went straight to the holding cell where Matthew was being held. As he entered, he could feel the tension in the air. Matthew sat there, his eyes reflecting a mix of anger and exhaustion. William knew that no apology could erase the harm that had already been done. "Mr. Jackson, I'm Lieutenant William. I'm here to apologize for what happened," William said, his voice full of regret. "I've reviewed the situation, and it's clear that our officers made a serious mistake. You will be released immediately, and I wanted to personally offer my apologies." Matthew looked at William for a few seconds, then sighed deeply. His voice, hoarse from frustration, carried the weight of his pain. "Do you think an apology is enough?" Matthew asked, his anger barely concealed. "I was arrested, treated like a criminal, just because I'm black. This system has made thousands like me suffer for decades. And you think an apology can fix that?" William stood silently. He knew Matthew was right. The problem wasn't just this one arrest, it was a deep-seated issue of systemic racism and abuse of power. But he also knew that the best he could do right now was to admit the mistake and try to make amends. "You're right," William finally said. "An apology won't fix what's happened, and it won't undo the harm this system has caused. But we will start from here. I hope that releasing you and launching an investigation into the officers involved will be the first step in correcting these wrongs." Matthew said nothing more. He knew the fight for justice didn't end here. It would be a long and difficult road. But he was ready for it. The next morning, Police Chief Johnson held a public press conference at the police headquarters. Standing before a room filled with reporters and cameras, he acknowledged the serious mistakes that had been made in Matthew Jackson's arrest and offered a sincere public apology. He also promised a thorough internal investigation into the misconduct of Robert and James. "I want to apologize to Mr. Jackson and the community for the errors that occurred. We are committed to conducting a full investigation and ensuring that incidents like this do not happen again. Justice and equality are core values that we will continue to strive to protect," Johnson said during the press conference. While the public apology from Chief Johnson was an important step, it wasn't enough to calm the widespread anger in the community. Protests continued, with people demanding not just accountability for Robert and James but sweeping reforms in the police department. The arrest of Matthew Jackson became a rallying cry for broader justice movements across the country. Signs reading "Justice does not stop at an apology" were hoisted high, and Matthew's name became a symbol of the larger fight for civil rights. Even after being released, Matthew's anger did not subside. He wasn't just angry for himself, he was enraged by how the system continued to function. The night after his release, Matthew couldn't sleep. Memories of every time he'd been stopped, questioned, and treated as less than because of his skin color flooded his mind. Despite being a successful lawyer, Matthew realized that his status didn't protect him from the injustice that black men still faced every day. Sitting in his home office, surrounded by stacks of legal files, Matthew pondered what to do next. Chief Johnson's apology, while sincere, wasn't enough. Matthew knew that in order to change a system rotten to its core, something stronger was needed: real action. He knew he was the person who could lead this movement. He decided to meet with community leaders, human rights organizations, and activists to discuss the next steps. He didn't want to just demand reform, he wanted to ensure the government was held accountable for making those changes. A few days later, in a small community center located in the black neighborhood where Matthew had grown up, a significant meeting was held. Leaders from major human rights organizations like the NAACP, Black Lives Matter, and other well-known activists gathered. Everyone knew the depth of injustice facing the Black community. And they also knew this was a crucial moment to push for real change. Matthew stood before the crowd. Looking around at familiar faces, the same people he had fought for justice with for years. He began to speak. His voice steady and resolute. We've heard too many apologies. But apologies aren't enough. I don't just want an apology for myself. I want an apology for every victim of discrimination, of abuse, of a legal system that's been distorted and no longer protects the people. Now is the time we demand real change. The room erupted in applause. Everyone listened intently as Matthew outlined his proposals. He wanted more transparency in policing, especially independent oversight to ensure that officers were held accountable for their actions. He also called for reforms in police training, emphasizing that systemic racism must be rooted out from the culture of law enforcement. We're not just asking for legal reform. Matthew continued. We need to change the hearts and minds of this country about what it means to be Black. Justice doesn't just live in the pages of law books, it has to live in our hearts. The meeting went on for hours, with lively discussions about reform strategies and the next steps in their fight. Matthew proposed the creation of an independent police oversight committee, comprised of community members, civil rights lawyers, and activists, to monitor police activity and ensure transparency. This idea was met with widespread support, with everyone agreeing that this was an essential step to ensuring accountability. Meanwhile, within the police department, tensions remained high even after Chief Johnson's press conference. While Matthew had been released and an apology had been issued, the fallout continued to affect the department. Some officers felt that Robert and James had acted irresponsibly and deserved to be punished. However, others believed that Johnson's apology had weakened the image of law enforcement, portraying the police as vulnerable to public pressure. A rift began to form within the ranks of the police department. Some conservative officers, particularly those who supported tough policing methods, voiced their discontent. They argued that the police were being handcuffed by the public and the media. Others, however, recognized that the system needed reform if public trust in the police was to be restored. Chief Johnson, aware of the division within his force, knew that words alone wouldn't resolve the issue. He began holding internal meetings with senior police leaders to discuss the necessary reforms. We can't ignore these problems any longer, Johnson declared in one of the meetings. We need to reform from within before the public completely loses trust in us. One of the most hotly debated topics was the proposal for an independent oversight committee, which Matthew and the community had called for. While initially met with resistance from some officers, Chief Johnson realized that this was a necessary step to regain public trust. He decided to support the proposal and began working with community leaders to set up the committee. As the internal investigation continued, the misconduct of Robert and James became increasingly clear. Both officers had failed to follow proper arrest procedures, and their lack of evidence when arresting Matthew was a blatant violation of civil rights. Facing immense public pressure and the findings from the internal investigation, Robert and James were immediately suspended from duty. The news of their suspension spread quickly, leading to mixed reactions. The community and protesters welcomed the decision, seeing it as a necessary step to address police misconduct. However, certain pro-police groups argued that the suspension was too harsh and that the officers were simply doing their jobs. Robert, once confident in his power, now felt fear creeping in. He wasn't just facing job loss, he could potentially face criminal charges for violating civil rights. James, his partner in the arrest, had become withdrawn, speaking little and showing signs of remorse. Both officers understood that they had crossed a line, and now they would have to face the consequences. Even with Robert and James suspended, Matthew knew his work wasn't finished. Suspending 2 officers was only a small part of the bigger battle. The police system had deep-rooted problems that needed to be addressed. and Matthew was determined to use his case as a catalyst for real reform. Matthew continued working with civil rights organizations and lawmakers to draft concrete policy reforms. He focused on establishing independent police oversight bodies and pushing for changes in police training programs. One of his key proposals was mandatory training on human rights, the history of racial discrimination in America, and how to engage with diverse communities. With the support of fellow lawyers and activists, Matthew drafted a petition calling for sweeping police reforms, which quickly gained tens of thousands of signatures from citizens across the city and the nation. While fighting for systemic reform, Matthew also pressed charges against Robert and James, filing a civil lawsuit for the violation of his rights. Matthew didn't just want justice for himself, he wanted to create a legal precedent that would empower others to challenge police misconduct. At the trial, Matthew presented a powerful case, recounting the details of his wrongful arrest and exposing the systemic problems within the police force. He didn't just argue the facts of his case, he framed it as part of a broader problem of racial injustice in law enforcement. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Matthew addressed the court. This isn't just about one wrongful arrest. It's about a system that has consistently treated people of color as criminals. If we don't demand accountability and fairness today, who will stand up for justice tomorrow? The jury deliberated for hours before delivering their verdict. Robert and James were found guilty of abusing their power and violating Matthew's civil rights. It was a landmark victory, not just for Matthew but for the broader civil rights movement. The case sent a clear message that law enforcement officers could not operate with impunity. After the trial, Matthew's case became a pivotal moment in the fight for police reform. Across the country, civil rights groups used the case as an example of how the legal system could be leveraged to hold police accountable. Matthew continued to lead efforts to reform policing policies, working closely with lawmakers to pass legislation that mandated the creation of independent oversight committees and required police to undergo cultural competency and de-escalation training. As for Robert and James, their careers in law enforcement were over. They faced not only professional disgrace but also potential legal action from other individuals who came forward with similar complaints of abuse. Years later, Matthew Jackson's case remained a cornerstone in the history of the civil rights movement. Law schools and civil rights organizations used it as a key example of how systemic change could be achieved through persistence in the legal system. Matthew's life became about more than just his legal victories. He became a symbol of resilience and courage in the fight for justice. The protests and advocacy he led changed not just his city's police system but inspired nationwide reforms. With each victory, Matthew remained grounded, knowing that the fight against injustice was a long and grueling one. But he was willing to face it, alongside the people who had stood by him from the very beginning. As Matthew looked back on what he had accomplished, he knew that every sacrifice, every moment of struggle, was worth it. Justice doesn't stop at an apology. And Matthew Jackson had proven that real change was possible if we are brave enough to demand it.